Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and Happy New Year, and welcome to the first lecture in the Health Law Institute Seminar Lecture Series for 2011. Today our topic is euthanasia in the Netherlands, medical practice and social control. And just before I introduce our speaker, I want to note and thank some additional sponsors we have for today's lecture. As always, we're sponsored by the law firm of Borden, Ladner, and Gervais, as well as the CIHR training program in health law, ethics, and policy. But in addition today, this lecture is sponsored by the Dalhousie European Union Center of Excellence, and we'd like to, in particular, thank Finn Larson for his contribution and help in that regard. And the lecture is also co-sponsored by the Canadian Centre of Ethics in Public Affairs, and we'd like to acknowledge and thank Chris Stover, as well as Dr. Sheila Brown for their contribution and support in that regard. While speaking of the Canadian Centre of Ethics in Public Affairs, we have evaluation forms today for this lecture. That's not something that's a normal feature of the Health Law Institute process, but it's a normal feature of CCEPA's process. And so we'd ask you kindly to fill out those evaluation forms before you leave today. I also wanted to emphasize, especially perhaps for those on this side of the room, there's a table over here with DVDs available. Everyone's free to take one. It has all of the lectures, seminars, activities that CCEPA has sponsored in recent years or over the years. Yeah, just a smattering, okay? So you're free to take one of those. Well, as I said some time ago now, our topic today is euthanasia in the Netherlands, medical practice and social control. And to speak to us on that topic, we have Dr. Hans van Delden. Is professor of medical ethics at the medical school at Utrecht University. He also works as a practicing physician in a nursing home in his home country of the Netherlands. His interest in the topic that he's going to speak with us today starts with his graduate studies, where he wrote a thesis on the medical and ethical aspects of do not resuscitate orders. And also he was one of the principal researchers of the study of medical decisions concerning the end of life for the Remelink Committee. He has been secretary of the International Association of Bioethics, and his special fields of interest are research ethics, moral problems at the end of life, and moral problems in the care of the elderly. So please join me in welcoming Dr. van Delden.
Okay, well, good afternoon. I'm very grateful that I can speak to you today, and I really appreciate this opportunity to show you some of the results of the studies that have been going on in the Netherlands. I think this is really valuable because I know there's a lot of interest in the debate on end-of-life issues here in Canada as well. And often you will see that at some point or other, some reference is made to the Netherlands. And often this will be in the form of quoting data and quoting research results. But I've come across a lot of misunderstandings and misquotations, and so I think it's a good opportunity for me to be here and to present you the studies as we've conducted them, and in order also to be able to interact with you and ask for you to ask questions, and for me, of course, to try to answer them. The first slide was the title of my presentation, Medical Practice and Societal Control. I think we ought to be able to address both issues. But of course, if you really ask me, I could spend probably a week talking to you about all the issues that are involved. So I will limit myself to certain features, of course. But if during the question and answer period you feel that other aspects need to be addressed, then please feel free to ask questions about that. This slide here is to acknowledge that, of course, the work for these studies hasn't been done by me on my own. Actually, if you can see this, there's a bunch of universities that combine their efforts, and it's Rotterdam University, Utrecht University, and Amsterdam University together that conducted these studies. So this is to acknowledge the work of many others together with me in doing these studies. before embarking on describing the studies and the results and all that, I should like to point out to you that these studies came about in a very interesting, I think, rather specific interaction. Oh, sorry, that was one too many. A specific interaction with policymakers, the law institutions in the Netherlands, and us as a research team. The thing is, I don't know about you in Canada, but we always have coalition governments. And the coalition government before the 1990s was one that sort of had reached agreement that they would not change the law with respect to euthanasia. And then that government fell over a tiny little issue, I forgot. And it's never really important, really, where they fell over. It's always something tiny, but apparently chemistry was worn out and then they fell and you have a new government. And the new government consisted of a new coalition and they had been divided on the issue. The new parties, now having to work together, were divided on the issue of euthanasia. And so there was sort of a political stalemate. They didn't know where to go. And I don't know about Canada, but what you do in that situation in the Netherlands is you create a commission. I mean, that's the perfect answer, because you have it off your agenda, someone else has to do the job, and it is sort of depoliticized, right? So that's what happened. And that's where the Remlin Committee really started to become a feature. The Remlin Committee was installed in 1989, and of course this was a professor emeritus of law, written these kind of books, and of course he wasn't going to do the study himself because he was far too eminent for that. And so he commissioned that to us, to Paul van der Maas, Loes Pijnenborg, and me. And we did the first study on the incidence and characteristics of euthanasia and other end-of-life decisions. Maybe I should say a word about the definition of euthanasia, but I'll do that shortly. Now after that, of course, and this is just to show you the interplay. We did a study, we reported in 1991, government prepared response, and in the end, in 1994, they changed the reporting procedure, and that of course led to a new situation, so they commissioned a new study. We did that, we came out with our findings. They said, well, okay, we see some improvement, but we still need to go further down this road, and so they changed the situation again by installing these review committees for cases of euthanasia. And then, of course, you can see the pattern. They needed a new study, which we did in 2001, and we came out with a report, and by that time there had been, a law had been accepted, and so after that, again, a new study had to be done, and that was the 2005 study, on which I'm going to tell you more. And actually, so this was the interplay that all the time we came out with results, a policy change was made, a new study was done. Again, this happened for several times. Actually, as a matter of fact, no change was made after 2002. So the story ends here, you might say. But still, the government felt that it would be helpful to know what's happening right now. So a new study was commissioned. And actually, we started in August last year to have a new series, a new round of data being gathered. And we'll probably report on that by the end of this year or maybe beginning of next year. So you'll see new data coming out from the Netherlands not long from now. But it's interesting to see how this interaction came about and how this worked out. As I said, in 2001 actually, a new law was accepted, and you may wonder why I put 2002 here if I just said 2001, but you have 2001 as the moment where Parliament accepted the new law, and 2002 as the moment where the law became effective. So you can either say 2001 or 2002, it doesn't matter, you'll refer to different moments in time. And the 2002 or 1 law created a new situation in which indeed euthanasia and assisted suicide were decriminalized in the Netherlands, and under certain conditions were accepted if performed by a doctor who kept to these requirements of prudent practice, due care criteria, and reported the case to a review committee. Those were the 3 conditions. So it had to be a doctor, he had to stick to these requirements, they are listed here, I'll go over them shortly, and then of course he would have to report. Anyway, I'll tell you what's there. The new law really focuses on physicians. Physicians should comply with certain criteria. They should act in a certain manner, and only if these conditions are met, they can. It will be said that they have done right in performing euthanasia. And these requirements are that there has to be a voluntary and well-considered request, that there has to be unbearable suffering with no prospect of relief, that the patient has to be informed of the situation and of the prognosis and of alternatives, especially alternatives in palliative care respect, that the doctor is convinced that there is no reasonable alternative for euthanasia or assisted suicide, so to comply with the request. He has to consult a colleague, an independent colleague, and everything has to be performed with due medical care. I think it would be wise already at this moment to point out to you that what you can see from this is that there are actually two justifications for euthanasia or assisted suicide at play in the Netherlands. It's not just autonomy. If you have autonomy only, it would be the first requirement mainly, right? And maybe some procedural requirements like the second physician and the exercise of due medical care. But if that would be it. But it's more than that. It's not just autonomy. It's not just the patient right that he wants to be put to death, and that's what he's asking. No, it's also the evaluation of the situation of the patient by the physician. That's why we have the second and the fourth criteria that ask for evaluation by the physician of the condition of the patient in terms of his or her well-being, quality of life, that type of thing. And it's interesting to see that this is not only, assessment of quality of life, so it's not only a patient thing, of course it is, but it's also a doctor thing in this law, in this framework. Especially clauses like no prospect of relief, meaning that there is no reasonable medical procedure that could be used to alleviate the suffering. And also the fourth clause sort of reinforces that there is, according to the physician, no reasonable alternative to comply with the request of the patient. So what you clearly see, and this will be something I'll get back to a number of times during this talk, what you really see, and this is important to see, that the way this is structured in the Netherlands, it's not only an autonomy thing, it's not a patient right, it's something that can be done by a physician if there is a patient request, but also if he himself independently comes to the conclusion that indeed there are enough reasons to comply with the request. It has been said once by a Dutch scholar that indeed that the main reason for complying with the request is not the request itself, but it's his independent evaluation that there are reasons from his own perspective to do so. And I'm emphasizing this because if you understand that, you will understand a lot about the Dutch situation that might go unnoticed if you think about this only as a patient right based on autonomy. Okay, interesting, but maybe a bit of a sideline, but in the new law, and this was new, there was no jurisprudence before that sort of gave a history to that. In this new law, there was also a provision that said that under certain circumstances, a doctor could also use an advance directive in which a patient who had once been competent and at that time wrote an advance directive in which he stated that under certain conditions, he would want his physician to perform euthanasia on him, that advance directive could be used, could replace the actual request as long as the other criteria, the other 5, are met. So the advance directive is seen as a thing that might replace the first criterion only, right? And then, of course, the other criteria would still be met. By the way, I think this is impossible, but we can get back to that. Okay, so this is the situation, right? We've had a number of studies. We started in 2005. The new law was enacted, and we started with this new study with the specific question whether the goals of the 2002 euthanasia law were met. And there were several parts. It was not just one study. We call it one study, but actually there were several studies. There was a death certificate study. There was a physician survey. There also was a legal analysis. I'm not going to discuss all that because you won't return to your homes before long. But I will only focus on the empirical results in order to tell you what we found. But you shouldn't simply believe me, of course. I have to show you where I got my data from and how we got them. So I will tell you just briefly what the methods were. If you want to know more about this, we've published a lot about this, so it will be easily found if you Google my name or Agnes van der Heijden or whatever. You will easily find the literature and the studies in which we explain how we did this. But for now, let it suffice that mainly in the empirical part, there were two studies. There was a death certificate study and a physician survey. The death certificate study works this way. If a patient dies, a doctor comes in and fills out a form in which he states which is the cause of death, right? I mean, that's going to happen in Canada as well, right? On that form, no patient names, but of course some criteria, characteristics of the patient, what he died of, how old he was, and the name of the physician appear. We drew a sample at the Central Bureau of Statistics of those certificates and went back to the physicians with a short questionnaire, 4 pages, 26 questions, and we asked them what had been decided, and maybe nothing had been decided, but if something had been decided in terms of end-of-life decision-making, what went before that, whether the patient asked for that or not, what the reasons were and all that, and how he would himself describe what he did, and so on. This was a short questionnaire, relatively short questionnaire, that was sent to the attending physicians of these deceased patients. We had a marvelous response. Well, if you're familiar with responses of written questionnaires, this is a marvelous response, because usually you are even happy if you are above 50%, right? So 78%, and this is very stable. If you look at the 1990, 95, 2001 studies, it's even increasing. So there's really commitment of the physicians in the Netherlands to have these studies done and have reliable results. Good part of having this death certificate study is that we really have a sound quantitative basis for our findings. The bad part, of course, is that you only work through people who are deceased. And of course, if you want to study end-of-life decision-making, not all of them die, because sometimes a patient might request for euthanasia, but the request is not complied with. So you would like to study that as well, but you would never find that case if you only look at patients who have died, right? So we also needed a physician survey in which we could ask for decision-making processes and not just those in which the result was the death of the patient. So we did that. It was a longer questionnaire, and you can see the effect that that has on response, because the longer your questionnaire is, I think this was a 20-page thing or something, the longer your questionnaire is, the lower your response. I mean, that's a law that governs our work as well. But this enabled us to ask for requests of euthanasia for other decision-making processes and so on. So these are the main methods. Now, in terms of definitions, I'm pretty sure that you all know that we define euthanasia as voluntary active euthanasia, but I thought I should mention it once again, because sometimes you'll see that you talk about euthanasia and I do so, but we mean different things, right? And that will be a bit of a problem. So here they are again, and I'm quite sure you're familiar with those. But if I talk about euthanasia, I will mean voluntary active euthanasia, right? What is sometimes called voluntary active euthanasia. And if I talk about assisted suicide, I will talk about assisted suicide, meaning that it's pretty much the same as euthanasia with one major difference, and that is that whereas in euthanasia it's the physician who acts last, in assisted suicide it's the patient who does so, right? That's basically the only difference. And it might be useful to know that the Dutch law on euthanasia, I keep calling it the Dutch law on euthanasia, right? But actually it's the Dutch law on the reporting of death on request. That's how it's called. And it governs both euthanasia and assisted suicide. So everything I say about the euthanasia law actually also governs the assisted suicide practice. Interesting, but maybe too detailed for now, is that we do indeed look at those two acts as pretty much of the same moral nature. That we do not really treat euthanasia as morally different than assisted suicide. And of course, just across the border here in the United States, they would do so. They would say that assisted suicide is much more autonomy grounded, whereas euthanasia has all these worrisome aspects of a physician doing the actual killing. So, that's a reason for them to see that, to say that euthanasia is something different. That's why in Oregon they only have physician-assisted suicide. legalized, right? It's not euthanasia. It's only physician-assisted suicide. But in the Netherlands, as I said, we treat them as two of a kind, and the law governs both practices. That's maybe helpful to know. Now, if you define euthanasia as voluntary active euthanasia, of course, you also have something that is not so voluntary. I mean, for a matter of logic, that's what you're going to find. And therefore, we also have acts that we call LAWER, or life-terminating acts without explicit request of the patient, not lawyer, but LAWER. This is what what we define them. They're pretty much the same, but now with the absence of an explicit request. Okay, since this was a study on end-of-life decision-making and not only on euthanasia-assisted suicide, we also looked at other end-of-life decisions, such as non-treatment decisions or situations in which you use drugs to alleviate symptoms that might, and certainly not always, but might hasten the end of life. Maybe I should say that now. I'm very much aware, also being a physician and treating patients myself, I'm very much aware of the fact that I think that I was raised as a medical student with too much of fear of morphine and the use of sedatives and so on. Because we were taught that there was a big chance of shortening the patient's life. And I think at present day, we do not think that that's true anymore, right? We think that if you use that in a proper manner and you carefully titrate the doses that you're using to the situation of the patient, actually what you might end up is life-longing. That your patient will live longer because the pain is better controlled. So I'm by no means suggesting here that whenever you use morphine or sedatives or whatever, you need to get scared and think that someone is trying to kill you. Not at all. By the way, I don't know about you, but we do encounter patients or families. You say, as a doctor, you say, well, I think we need to use morphine, and you'll see them thinking, yeah, I know what you're saying. But that's not true, right? That's not true. I'm not suggesting that the use of morphine and sedatives is always going to hasten the end of life of the patient. Not at all. But sometimes it might. And if it does, or if you seriously think that it might, then indeed we are in an area that you might want to consider as end-of-life decision-making. Non-treatment decision, basically the same story, right? I mean, not all decisions to stop treatment will result in hastening the end of life of the patient. Certainly not. For instance, do not resuscitate decisions are a clear case in point, because if the patient doesn't arrest, you do not have to use cardiopulmonary resuscitation, and therefore it will never influence the timing of death. But they might, and then, of course, you're in the area where you might call them end-of-life decision. Terminal sedation, actually also the same story. Some of those instances, no hastening of death at all. Patient was close to death anyway. You give him a sedative, you do not give him a fluid. He doesn't die a second earlier than would have done otherwise. At the same time, if you stop feeding me or providing me with some water and you sedate me, I would probably die earlier than otherwise. And you could call that terminal sedation. Our definition of terminal sedation was the deep and continuous sedation till the end of life. We could spend a whole day on the definition of terminal sedation and on whether or not that is something that might be, ethically speaking, equivalent of euthanasia. I think it might sometimes be, but we could address that issue later. It has been an object of our study, and that's why I report on it. Okay, finally, some results. Still have 50 minutes to go. Finally, some results. This slide is basically to tell you that the Netherlands is pretty much a comparable country as any other. It doesn't tell you that, but I'll tell you why it does so. Anyway, what you see here is that, and I'll explain what is there in little white letters. You won't be able to read those. On the far left are cases of euthanasia. The second group of bars is assisted suicide. The third is not on request, so the lower cases. The fourth, more to the right here, is alleviation of symptoms, and this is non-treatment. This is the Netherlands, but we've also studied, the 2001 study actually was a European study. So all data on the Netherlands were gathered in this European framework. And we compared the study, the results of the Netherlands to those other five other European countries. And all of these countries pretty much had the same shape. Basically, what happens in medical practice is here on the right side. Alleviation of pain and symptoms with possible life-shortening effect and non-treatment decision-making. This is another slide that shows you that the same numbers, but now with absolute numbers attached to them, and I've enlarged the bars so you can only see euthanasia and assisted suicide now. That's the focus of my talk, right? What you see is that the number of cases has changed a little bit over the years. It started with 2,700 cases of euthanasia, went up to 3,500, and came down again to 2,300 in 2005 after the law. And what you can also see is that assisted suicide is actually a rather limited practice. Maybe a surprise to you. It was a surprise to us, actually, when we did the first study in 1990. This was a surprise. We thought, why is this? I mean, whatever I say about autonomy and beneficence being the two foundations of this practice, I would have expected that assisted suicide would have been the predominant phenomenon. But it's not. It's actually much less than euthanasia. One explanation might be the physical condition of the patient, might be, but certainly not in all cases. Anyway, the other interesting message here, of course, is that after the law, the numbers dropped. Terminal sedation, some numbers on that too. What you can also see is that there are only 2 bars here, which is good because now they're large enough for you to see them. By the way, you must have gotten, I didn't specifically mention that, but of course the colors refer to the different years of the studies, and so you can see how that worked out. The first years, we didn't ask information about terminal sedation. Why not? Terminal sedation is not new, but the concept is. The concept in end-of-life decision-making and in the debate about that is rather new, so we didn't start asking questions until 2001. That's why we only have the red and the green bar here. What you can see also is that this is a rather prevalent practice. This is about 8% of annual death, and it rose from 2001 to 2005. These are other numbers. Here we look at the requests for euthanasia. Now, I don't know if you still have that in your mind, but if you go back to this slide, let's say that by and large, the incidence of euthanasia is 3,000, right? If you add up, let's say 3,000, simply, for sake of the argument just now. And if you look at these numbers, you'll see it's 9,000, by and large. I mean, a little bit less, a little bit more, it doesn't matter. 9,000. What that means is that 1 out of 3 requests gets complied with. Simple, right? You don't need to be a mathematician to be able to deduct that. That means that out of every 3 requests, only 1 request gets complied with. Maybe I have a request now. Not for euthanasia, by the way. And you could look at that in 2 ways, and I've encountered both responses to that. One response is, good. At least these physicians are doing what they are supposed to do. They are here to see whether the condition of the patient is indeed such that fulfilling the request is warranted. That's what they're tasked with. That's what they're doing. Because apparently, in 2/3 of cases, they say, well, no, you're not suffering bad enough. But already phrasing it that way makes you aware of the second response to this, right? Who are you to decide that I'm not suffering enough? So indeed, you can also respond to these numbers, and especially the 2 slides that I gave you, by saying, hey, listen, this means you have a serious problem, that some patients are not getting what they want. And this is not a matter of being childless because you want to get what you want. But this is about having a serious request and someone else turning it down. So at least some people will say that this is a reason for a change in the law. And actually, there is an initiative right now coming from the public to change the law. I'm not predicting that it's going to happen anyway, because the present government is busy with all kind of non-issues like Muslim threats and that. Sorry about that. Anyway, the government is not interested in medical ethics anymore, which is good. And they are are not going to change the law. But there is this public initiative that says that we should have a change in law precisely to accommodate for this, because some patients do not want to have such a strong evaluative role for the doctor. And that is grounded in these kind of data. Okay. Gosh, the time. Just some figures about, let's say, the epidemiology of this. What you can see and probably know is that euthanasia-assisted suicide in the Netherlands is performed primarily by general physicians, not in hospital, not in nursing homes, that it's related to patients who have cancer mainly, I mean, really predominantly cancer, not stroke, not Alzheimer, not other degenerative diseases, but cancer. And therefore, this is epidemiology, I mean, therefore, it is predominantly in, let's say, the age group 65 to 80. Not the oldest old, but 65 to 80. Why? Because that's the age group in which you get cancer and die of it. I mean, if you survive over 80, you're probably not going to die of cancer. That's epidemiology, not ethics. So this is, let's say, this societal part of that. This is euthanasia-assisted suicide are predominantly phenomena in the last stages of life of patients dying of cancer. Interestingly, of course, we asked in the survey, I should note, otherwise you would tell me, but this is true, of course, that we asked physicians what were the reasons of the patient. That's not very strong, I know, but the patient was no longer there to ask. So we had to ask physicians what were the reasons for the request of the patient. And the breakdown is interesting because, again, I think it's a little bit little, but I'll guide you through it. If you look at that, you'll see that it's not all pain that dominates this picture. It's actually other things that dominate the picture, that dominate the reasons for requesting euthanasia. It's things like loss of dignity, or no prospect of relief, or expected suffering. And of course, this is important because now and then you'll hear the answer, you Dutch, you don't have adequate palliative control, palliative care, and if you would have that, then you wouldn't have your euthanasia practice, right? I mean, probably some of you is going to remark that in the discussion later on. And to a certain extent, I don't think it's true. I'll respond to that later on. But this breakdown tells you that it can never be true, because palliative care is not going to take care of all these things. It might, for some, but it's not going to take care of all these reasons. So from this you can learn that indeed good palliative care is paramount, certainly, no doubt about that. But it's not going to take away completely the need for euthanasia and assisted suicide, at least not in the Netherlands. Also interesting, we asked physicians how they felt about euthanasia, about performing that, and almost all said they never get used to it, that this remains an extraordinary thing to do, and they never get used to it. This is not something that you sort of are coming to terms with easily. Also interesting, I did mention that the new law opened up this possibility to act upon a written advance directive with an incompetent patient if all other 5 criteria were met. Remember, I told you. Hasn't been done. No physician has ever done it. That was 2005. I have reason to believe that that is still the case. No case of that sort has been presented to the review committees. And I think the physicians are right, but I can explain you later in the discussion why I think that's true. Okay, just as a follow-up on that little story about palliative care, sometimes the fact that in the Netherlands indeed there are only few hospices is seen as a reason or as an explanation for us having a euthanasia-assisted suicide in the first place. I don't think that's true. It is true we do not have much or many hospices, but that doesn't mean we do not have palliative care. Actually, we do have good palliative care, I admit. The discussion about euthanasia-assisted suicide did serve as an incentive for the improvement of palliative care. And actually what we have seen in the mid-90s was that the discussion on that issue really gave rise to a lot of initiatives in palliative care. But at present, there was a recent study in which the Dutch came out as, I think, the third of Europe in terms of the quality of palliative care. So palliative care in the Netherlands is pretty much up to standards, although it is organized not primarily in hospices, but through other existing tiers in healthcare, and it's functioning quite well, with the GPs, of course, in the central role, and GPs being in the central role in much of healthcare system in the Netherlands anyway. Okay, just a few more words about public control, because, you know, it's one thing to see whether in an individual case there is justification for complying with the request for euthanasia of that individual person. That's one thing. And often you'll find that even people who are strongly against legalizing euthanasia can think of cases in which they might be willing to say, well, it is wrong, but okay, I can understand why you're doing it. So in individual cases, sometimes things are acceptable that are not acceptable as a practice. And that's exactly why I think you have to discern between these two questions, whether or not you justify complying with the request in an individual case as an exceptional case, or whether you want to have a practice. And of course, if you do want to have a practice and legalize that, then the next question is, how are you going to make sure that the conduct is according to that practice, to the policy? There have been several ways of trying to have public control in the Netherlands. And actually, this is the other part of what I already showed, all the studies being done, one of the first slides, remember? And now I'll show you what happened. Before 1990, there wasn't much of a special reporting procedure. It was simply the police going to the practice of the physician and taking him in as a murder suspect, which wasn't exactly helpful in terms of reporting. But that's the way it went. And then, of course, after that, after our study came out, the first thing that the government did was say, well, at least we want to have a uniform reporting procedure in which the physician reports to the coroner, who is a colleague. And then the coroner can report to the prosecutor, but it's no longer the police that starts to investigate, it's the coroner. That helped, but not enough, as I can show you later. And that's why in 1998, these committees were invented, consisting of a lawyer, an ethicist, and a doctor, who would then investigate all individual cases that were brought to the attention of these committees. It's interesting, together with Jocelyn Downey this morning, we thought about all the possible goals of having an oversight mechanism. And it's interesting to notice that in the Netherlands, what we have, and this is a choice out of many, is a system in which we have retrospective oversight. It's not before the act, but it's post hoc. But we do study individual cases. It's not, for instance, in Oregon, you'll have an administrator collecting data and reporting on that on an aggregate level. He is not going to look into individual cases. We have individual cases being looked into, but only after the fact. So these committees came into being. I was a member of one of those from 1998. At that moment, the mandate of these committees was only to advise the prosecutor. Later on, after the new law, they were mandated even to settle the case and to say that the doctor acted according to the rules or not. If you want to have more information on the ways and the mandate that this commission, these review committees work, then I advise you to go to the website. It's in English. And you can see also the text of the law, but also the way that they function. Okay, well, and here are the results of this public control. I'll guide you through this one as well. The red bars are actually the very same numbers that I've been showing you earlier. So these are the numbers that we found in our 4 studies. That's why we only have 4 red bars here. So with let's say the approximately 3,000, remember? The number of cases of euthanasia-assisted suicide. Started with 2,700, you can see that, went up to 3,500, a little bit more if you add the assisted suicide cases, and came down to 2,300 cases of euthanasia with 100 cases of assisted suicide, so that explains those 2,400 cases. And those are the red bars. And those are those are the cases that are really performed. And then in yellow, well, let's call it yellow, right? Or let's call it yellow. Okay. In yellow are the number of cases that were reported, and reported to whatever oversight committee or function or whoever was functioning at that moment, right? I mean, in 1990, that was the police. After that, it was the coroner. And after 1998, it was the review committee, who then got a different mandate in 2002. So the person that accepted the reports was different in these years, but some way you could still compare them. And what you can see is that, by and large, the reporting proportion increased, right? It was 18% in 1990. It was 41% in 95. It was 51 here in 2001, and it went up to 80% here in 2005. Well, that was really satisfactory for the government. They really concluded that after the new law, apparently, the willingness to report had increased such that they thought that no further change of the law was needed. And I already told you right in the beginning that after 2002 there was no change in policy, so the fifth study is not a response to this change. It is simply there because they want to keep track of what's happening. What you can also see, and that's interesting, is that in 2009 the numbers of cases reported went up to 2,600. So that's even more than the number that we found in 2005. And I can tell you that the number of 2010 will be even higher again. It will be something like 2,800, which can mean nothing else but that indeed the red bar that we are going to find next year or this year will be higher again. It can mean nothing else. So it means that apparently this response to the law was also a bit of caution. What's happening exactly? How are they doing this? What exactly is the interpretation of these new rules? And that explains in part why there was this drop in frequency and incidence. And I expect that what we are finding right now will be something higher than before, than in 2005. What is also interesting, I mean, if 80% is a lot more than 54, right? And therefore the government was really pleased. But still, it is only 80%. And you could argue, and probably you will, that the more problematic cases are probably in the other 20%. That it's only the beauties that are presented as such to the committee. So you could say that the other 20% remains hidden, and that especially that is still a problem. Well, of course, there's some truth in that. But this breakdown tells you a bit of a different story, and I'll try to explain what's the story here. What we did is we looked at the drugs used in specific cases of euthanasia. And it turned out that all cases of assisted suicide were actually reported. No exception. If what we have come to see as the standard drugs for euthanasia, this may sound weird, right? And especially if I'm talking a little bit fast and see the time moving, I get so accustomed to certain terms that I forget all the provisions that I should make, and so I talk about standard drugs of euthanasia, and you might think standard drugs of euthanasia. But still, if the standard drugs of euthanasia are used, then we found that 99% of cases was reported. On the other hand, if euthanasia was performed with other drugs like morphine, or someone tried to perform euthanasia with other drugs like morphine, then only 2% was reported. What's also interesting is I said to you earlier that we did not only ask what the doctor did and whether he consulted another physician and talked to the patient and all that, but also how he himself would have called the act. I said that. And that showed us that in cases where what we called euthanasia cases were not reported, in a lot of cases, 79%, the doctor himself thought no life termination had happened at all. maybe it's good to see that this 4-page questionnaire, remember, with the 78% response, it didn't ask, did you perform euthanasia? The question was, did you administer a drug with the explicit intention to shorten life? That was the question. If someone said yes to that question, and later on said, was that on the explicit request of the patient, and said yes again, the 2 yeses made us put that case in the box of euthanasia, right? So it wasn't that they didn't have to have an understanding of euthanasia. We wanted them to describe their act as closely to the act as possible. So this might mean 2 things. Either we have misclassified some of these cases that we, the researchers, call them euthanasia because of the answers to the questions. But that, as a matter of fact, you might doubt whether they really are. But it might also mean that the doctors not always use the terms in the right way. That sometimes they think they're not doing euthanasia in their own terms. But if you look at what they have said yes to, you would say, well, listen. I mean, the question was, did you administer a drug with the explicit intention to shorten life? If you say yes to that, I mean, what else can it be, right? So I still think we're right, of course. But it also means that there's room for improvement here in terms of education. And of course, being a professor of medical ethics myself, that is what I do. In the medical curriculum, I have now devoted some time to explain these terms and also explain what varieties of decisions you could encounter and how they would classify or not. But this is interesting. It means that according to this breakdown, if a physician recognizes what he did as euthanasia or assisted suicide, him or herself, he will report. If he doesn't recognize it as such, obviously, he will not report because he will not think that he has to, right? So there is room for improvement here through education. Make sure that they know what they ought to know, that they know how to classify what they're doing. And then you're safe. At least that's what we deduct from this. Okay, let's say that this is the final sheet. It isn't, but let's say it is because you're getting nervous, right? I set out with the question whether or not the goals of the law were met. And our conclusion was yes, they are, to a certain extent. The legal reliability for physicians has improved, certainly. I mean, we came from a situation in which there was case law, and case law helps, but it's never really safe when it comes to your specific case, right? When it comes to societal control, reasonably well. 80%, good, but not good enough. I mean, should be better. And that's where this comes in. Let's talk to these students and also physicians and make sure that they understand what euthanasia means and when they're doing that and what they have to do afterwards, of course. From the reports of the review committees, we could see that actually when they did it and when they reported it, they did go along that 6th criterion, which is to exercise due medical care. What, of course, was not within our scope as a study to evaluate the law was whether or not this was a good law. Well, it is to a certain extent, but again, if you want to strike a different balance, if you want to say this is too much about doctors and end of life, and it's not enough about patients and end of life, it's not enough about patient rights and autonomy, then you would need a completely different law. Well, of course, that was without our scope. Or beyond our scope. It's not for us as a committee or as researchers to tell the government that they should make a different law. But it clearly came out that at least some parties in society would like to strike a different balance in this respect. Well, there is more. There's much more. But there should also be a room and time for you to ask me questions and to explore details that you want to know about. So I think I should end here and hand over the floor to you.
there was a surprising statement that more than half of the patients who received assisted suicide or euthanasia was the reason for loss of dignity.
Yeah.
Loss of dignity is always bandied around in the public sphere. That's very important to age with dignity, die with dignity, and live with dignity. But it's very difficult to measure. Now, for pain, you have sort of a scale. You can, although not objectify, but at least to measure to some extent. But how can you measure dignity?
Well, there are even more problems attached to dignity, as you may well be aware of. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what you mean with dignity. And probably you're not exactly sure what I mean with dignity either. And we're not exactly sure what the doctors meant with dignity or what these patients thought with dignity. Because you'll be aware of the fact that, of course, claims to dignity are invoked on either sides, right? There are some who say dignity is unqualified. Everyone has dignity. Even those who are suffering and in agony, they still have dignity because man is shaped to the image of God, and therefore you still have dignity. But there are also those who say, well, no, dignity is an individual evaluation of whether or not I live according to my standards. And then they'll say, that's why I can say, well, I can say, individually, that this is not according to my perception of dignity, and that's why I think dignity is a reason for my request here. So dignity is a problematic concept. I agree entirely with you. There are no measures or scales or questionnaires to measure that easily. I mean, you are maybe aware of the work of Harvey Chochinov here in Canada. And Chochinov is one who tries to do this. It's very interesting what he tries to do, and also how he tries to make that work as a basis for changing this. Because I mean, I went very fast, right? And there's much more to say. And I said that this was a sign of things that could maybe only slightly be influenced by palliative care. And what he said is that, no. You can change your feelings of dignity. So he invented an intervention to increase your feeling of dignity. But your point, whether or not we can measure this, is completely correct. The answer is no. It's there because it is a reason that is cited by the patients, and in this time by the physicians who were the treating physicians of these patients. But if you want to know precisely what is meant by them, I don't know. Lengthy answer, sorry.
Thank you for your presentation. Could you comment on the possibilities of travel or tourism euthanasia in the Netherlands?
Yeah.
It's at the back of all our minds after your
Is it?
visit.
Is it?
Oh, yes.
Come to the Netherlands, get killed.
At our
Legalize drugs first.
Yeah. Well, there's actually quite easy follow-up on what I said that answers your point. First of all, you are probably aware of the fact that such a assisted suicide tourism, if you want to call it that, does exist in Switzerland, right? In Switzerland, I didn't talk about Switzerland, but Switzerland has a permissive regime with respect to assisted suicide, not with respect to euthanasia. Doctors want to have nothing to do with it, but there is this system which allows laymen to assist with suicide. And it doesn't matter where you come from, so there exists not very large, but limited practice of assisted suicide tourism from one-way ticket from Germany or the United Kingdom to Switzerland, right? And actually, that's the Swiss government is not happy with that, but that's another story. In the Netherlands, as I explained to you, this is vital. It's always the whole practice is founded on these two issues: autonomy, self-determination, but also on the assessment of the physician of the situation of the patient. And that means, actually, that we think of euthanasia as a last resort issue. It's something, well, ideally, this is a wrong word, right, ideally, but still, ideally, it's something that is seen as the last resort that this patient, together with this physician, choose at the end of a trajectory that they went through together, right? So therefore, there is no perceived opposition between palliative care and euthanasia. This may sound weird to you, but the idea is that euthanasia, in a way, is maybe the final part of palliative care. This may sound weird, and maybe you're attacking me on it, but that's the way that we view it. Which means you're getting the image of a treating physician who is doing his best to take care of the suffering of this patient, does everything a normal physician would do in trying to alleviate that. But if he isn't successful enough and the patient wants it, then he still has this option of assisted suicide or euthanasia. But we have sort of embedded this so much in this treating physician-patient relationship that if you would now take the plane and come to Utrecht and enter my office and say, hey, Hans, I met you in Halifax, and can you kill me? I would say no. First of all, you don't seem to qualify. But second of all, I would not be your treating physician. And there would have to be some sort of a history of being the treating physician. Now, I say some sort because we do know of physicians who are adamantly against euthanasia and refer their patient to another physician, let's say only shortly before dying, the patient. And then, of course, this history would be only small, but we would say, well, there was a history with a treating physician, and it changed persons, but it didn't change the nature of the relationship. But there would have to be this context of a patient being treated by a physician over a certain period of time, and not just walking into an office and out of the blue saying, hey, would you kill me? Because that's not the way this is shaped. And I'm not saying that this is the only way to look at it, but that's the way it's shaped, right? So no tourism to the Netherlands, at least not for this. Yeah. Are you standing there in front of the microphone to wait? Well, maybe you ought to have a chance, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Nuala Kenny. I'm the Emeritus Professor of Bioethics here at Dalhousie. I'm also the Ethics and Health Policy Advisor, now in my semi-retirement, for the Catholic Health Association of Canada. And many people in this room know I'm very opposed to both euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. So by transparency, as I start. You gave me a lot of clarity about things, having read them, about the Netherlands that I really appreciate. So thank you very much for that. It's very clear. And there were two things that you indicated that I want to mention as reinforcements from your experience for my own and my own conclusions. The first one, I was actually astounded by the fact that euthanasia occurs so much more frequently than physician-assisted suicide. Remarkable difference from North America. And that reinforces my concern, twofold, for physicians. I am a physician. One is the enormous power that we are putting into the hands of doctors with all of this, number one. And on the other side of it, as a physician, the erosion of moral agency of physicians in this accommodating requests without the physician judgment, which is the role of the physician, I think you've mentioned very nicely there. So that information from you I thought was extremely helpful. The second thing, when you indicated that the actual reasons for request, and the words I would use from an international review I've just done and is being published in a palliative care textbook this year, on reasons for request, they have very little to do with physical pain and other physical symptoms. They are truly about suffering. And for folks in this room who need to reflect on the difference between pain and suffering, which is a human total experience, I think what you've indicated to me that is very helpful, not in reassuring me, but in increasing my concern, is that one of the issues we must address socially is that euthanasia and assisted suicide are the medicalization of human suffering, and as such cannot in any way be confined logically to end of life. Big concern, but your information I thought was very clear and very helpful to me. Thank you.
Okay, still looking for whether there was a question in this. But I thank you for being so transparent about your background. And maybe I should have said that right at the beginning. I'm not here to sell euthanasia or to persuade you in any way. I think I'm glad for the opportunity to be here and to talk about these studies, because I think in a way the Netherlands can serve as a, maybe if you want to call it that way, as a social experiment to the world to see what's happening here. And we could probably discuss whether or not you should be reassured or your worries should be reinforced. But I think it's only fair if I can tell you what the numbers are and how to interpret them, how we found them, and why we have this and not that. Just to respond quickly to your first remark, we were surprised as well with the difference between euthanasia and assisted suicide. And actually, I would have hoped that it would have been the other side. And I do see your point of maybe doctors getting too much power. I do see that point. And sometimes even with students, I see that they sort of start to think too easily about this. And that's why I inserted the data on the fact that doctors, but of course those are the practicing ones who have been there for a longer time, they still say that no, every time is difficult. And I would say, good, keep it that way. And that's actually the message that I'm also trying to bring to my students. Because sometimes they say, well, yeah, we can do that. Oh, yeah, why not? But that's not the way to view this. I mean, if you're going there, and of course you would not want me to go there, but if you're going there, then at least keep a view on what is happening there. And that the best thing to do is to say that this is the least bad of two options that are probably both bad, right? So I think we may be closer together than you think. Yeah. Okay. There were other hands. Yes, please.
Following up on what Sister Nuala was distinguishing between the suffering and the pain, in all those criteria that the patients gave for their rationale, do you have data on how many of those were the 1/3 accepted by the doctors or 2/3 rejected?
Oh, yes.
Interesting to identify.
Yeah. Maybe if you come to me later, I'll direct you to an article. But we have published largely on all of these issues, and there are also articles on the refusal of requests and the reasons for that. And there's probably a breakdown in those articles on what the reasons were and why then the doctor refused the request. I can give you the reference. Yeah. Okay. But these were not criteria, of course. These were reasons given by the physician as a proxy for the patient in this time. Yeah, yeah. Okay, I saw you first.
My question was regarding living wills and possibly proxy decision-making for euthanasia in terms of dealing with patients who may be pediatric or an elder who has become incapacitated during their stay in hospital or through their illness. So how does that work in Holland? Is there euthanasia requested by a proxy decision maker who has legal authority over medical issues? How does that shake out?
Okay, that's a complicated story. So this is the euthanasia law, and I said that it did open the way for acting upon an advance directive, right? That would not be a proxy asking for, it would actually be the patient, him or herself, but through this advance directive, right? So that's maybe outside of the scope of your question, right? Okay. Okay, the formal answer is no, proxies are never entitled to ask for euthanasia on behalf of someone else. But you're probably aware of what is called, has become known as the Groningen Protocol. Are you?
I'm sorry.
Okay, I should give you that reference too. And there is a situation in which, and this involves newborns. For instance, sometimes, you may be familiar with that situation, that treatment is withdrawn. Let's say the treatment is considered to be futile, Let's say this was discussed with the parents and it was decided to withdraw treatment, for instance, a ventilator, right? And what we will do, and probably you too, is you take off the ventilator and you give the child to the mother or to the father, and you hope it will die peacefully in the arms of the father or the mother, right? And most of the time that happens, especially if you support that with some medication, but sometimes it doesn't. And at least it is perceived as agony, what the result, the situation. And in that situation, sometimes drugs are given, administered, that do end the life of that newborn. Mark my words, after first make this decision to discontinue life support, and only in cases, of course, in which this agony is then present. It would not be, in terms of law, it would not be seen as parents requesting ending of life. It would actually be seen as, it would be ending of life. And this is not under this law, because this law is only for competent persons or for mature people. Well, there is a certain scheme between 12 and 18. You have dual consent, both the parents and the child. But under 12, there's no way that this law is. The law is simply silent about every child under 12. And it would not be seen as the parents having a power or a legal position to ask for this. But if in that situation the doctor would say, well, or probably the parents would say, doctor, please do something. And then the doctor would do something, and it would be with consenting parents. It would still be viewed as life termination. It has to be reported to a separate committee that comes under a different ruling. It's not a law, actually. But there would not be such a thing as authority of the parents to ask for that. Is that an answer to your question?
Just a follow-up, with advanced directives then, do they have to be drafted with a physician and or other healthcare practitioner?
No.
Or are they just a general wish list of how they want to
No. I mean, my response to you still holds, so it wouldn't count. But if you would now take that paper in front of you and write down that under certain conditions you would want, then that would go as an advanced directive. Yeah. Yeah. There was someone else here. Was that you? Yeah. Okay.
Can you tell us more about the 0% of physicians who complied with the advanced directive in case of dementia?
Yeah. I can tell you more about everything here. But only in 2 minutes. Well, I'm trying to look for the shot, but you know where it was, right? What exactly is your question? Why does this happen?
Well, you made parenthetical remarks at the time that you said you thought that was the right decision.
Yeah. Okay. I'll go back to the. I can show you why this is a bad idea. Because the text is, you can look at the advanced directive as a substitute for the first rule, right? And then the second part of that sentence reads, as long as the other criteria are met. And I think that doesn't work. Why? Unbearable suffering with no prospect of relief actually contains 2 clauses. No prospect of relief is a medical judgment. Unbearable suffering is not. It's subjective. Now I have in front of me, and actually I do have patients who are demented, who are under my care, who have a written advance directive asking me to put them to death in case they become demented. Well, they are. So they're actually asking me, right? But they're happily drinking their tea and sitting there quiet, and they're well, I'm not saying they're happy, but it's not exactly suffering of the type that would bring me to perform euthanasia. So are they unbearable suffering? I don't know. That's hard to assess, right? They once thought that they would be, but are they? Difficult. Inform the patient of her situation and prognosis. Impossible, right? I could tell someone else, but as I explained just now, they are not viewed as having authority. So they're not sort of the replacement of the proxy decision maker here. So who am I going to inform? No reasonable alternative. Okay, well that works to a certain extent, but if you would read the law, go to that website, you would see that it reads that according to the patient and the physician together, there is no reasonable alternative. How am I to judge that on my own? Consult colleague, great, that works. Exercise due medical care to a certain extent works as well. Visualize this a little bit, right? Again, this is now, this is a nursing home, and this is the living room of that nursing home. And this is the person that has written that advance directive, right? This is how it goes. The person is entering the nursing home on day 1. On day 2, our administrator sends a letter to the physician, the general physician, please give me your medical files and so that I can read what happened before, right? And out of those medical files falls an advance directive. That's how I get to know it, right? So on day 5, no, later, because it will take a while before the general physician sends that document to me, right? But let's say 1 month later, what do? I go into the living room and say, well, hey, listen, this is what you've written. Come with me. Imagine the fear that would sort of bring about. So in a way, advance directives are instruments to ignore time, right? You write it at this moment and it gets enacted at that moment. And maybe it works if you're completely comatose and you're not responding in any way. But that demented person has wishes, has desires, has a certain quality of life. It may not be optimal in our eyes, but he is living, and he is expressing preferences that may not be the same as the ones that he thought he would have when he wrote the advance directive. So whom should I follow, right? And that's why I think that actually, I know why this is there. This was the former Minister of Health who wanted this to be there, Mevrouw Borst. And she really wanted that to be there, and there it is. But I think in reality, it's impractical. It's not feasible. And that's why I think practice shows you that only 0%, so none, ever complied with that request. The consequence should be that, for instance, the Voluntary Euthanasia Society should tell their members, well, listen, you can write this down, but please do not look at this as a guarantee that it will happen, because it's far from sure that it will happen. Actually, the reverse is true. And, well, I explained why this is so. Yeah?
Thank you.
Okay. You're standing, so I should be silent.
Well, we're over time, and I think it's telling that nobody is moving, right? You have our rapt attention. Before I ask you to join me again in thanking Dr. Van Delden, I just want to mention that our next lecture is on Friday, February 11th. It's our own Matthew Herder, who will be speaking about can patients shape the who, how, and what of academic science evidence from epigenetics. And now I would ask you again to join me in thanking Dr. Van Delden very much.